Hey, welcome back to Way of the Wrench, and on today's very special episode I'm going to be attempting my very own do-it-yourself lockdown bar, and I'm going to try to do this without any kind of welding so that you guys at home can do the same thing for your virtual pinball cabinets. So let's go figure this out. So first things first, why am I doing this? Well, I could just go out and buy a lockdown bar, especially if I was smart and I designed my cabinet to fit the stock parts. However, I chose not to because I wanted to try to save some money. So for me living up in Canada, to get a lockdown bar plus a lockdown receiver shipped all the way up here, plus duty and plus taxes, it was really quite a lot of money. And I was like, man, I could probably make something for like a tenth the price. So this is why I am doing it. But for you guys out there that don't want to attempt this, you can get lockdown bars and you can even get custom lengths so that if you have a wider cabinet, you can get that happening too. And I think they're about $150 US. Now, for me, I wanted to make this a budget build and I wanted to have it as DIY as possible for you guys at home. So I'm going to try to make one, and I've never made one of these before, so I'm going to have to figure this process, and I'm going to kind of talk you through it as well, and we'll learn from my mistakes and see what works and what doesn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some hammer forming. So what I need to do is make a form pretty much of exactly what I need, and then I'm going to make a top kind of clamping piece, and you take your sheet metal and you cut it to the right specs, put it in between the two pieces, clamp on really hard, and then use a hammer and basically hammer down the sheet metal around the shape of the form that you made. And at the end of the day, you have something that looks really realistic with what you want. So we got some things to figure out first though. Okay, so the first dimension we need is the width of the cab. And in my case, this is going to be 26.5 inches to the outside. Now remember that we have this stainless steel playfield glass holder trim that's going to go on the sides, and it's being held in place with one of these chrome kind of carriage bolts. And so we have to measure that thickness. Then you're going to times that by 2 because there's one on both sides, and add those two together. And that is going to be the minimum length of our form that we need to make. So in my case, that's going to be 26.75 inches long. Then the next dimension is the depth of the form. So we want that form to come down around the front. So we can measure from the front of the cab, and I want to go in 3 inches. And to make sure that I for sure get 3 inches, I'm going to add even 1/16 to make sure that happens and covers up the edge of this monitor bezel. Now to figure out the depth of the form, you have to look at what you're making. So I want to have at least 1 inch of the sheet metal coming down, so we need that for sure. But I also don't want to be trying to like hammer that 1 inch down and it's already hitting the bottom of the table, or the sheet metal is a bit long and it starts to bottom out. So I am going to extend that. Now we can extend that quite a bit. You could even add probably another inch. That way for sure you have enough room for that edge of the sheet metal to go down as you're hammering. So I'm going to make mine 2 inches deep. Now I would also install your coin door just to be able to check this dimension here to make sure that you have that 1 inch. So in my case I have 1 inch and 1/8, so that'll just barely clear if I make that lockdown bar 1 inch long. Now when it comes to picking the materials to make the form, it depends on a couple things. The first one is how many parts are you making? And in our case we're only going to make one of these lockdown bars, so we only really need this form to last at least once. So if you're going to do that, then you could probably make something out of MDF. Now I would probably stick to something like 3/4 inch thick MDF, and don't plan for this thing to be able to make another part. By the time you have done your thousands of hits on the hammer and the hammer forming, you're probably going to have this thing a little bit dented and chipped. It'll get you one part good, but after that it's pretty much garbage. Now, if you are making multiples, you may want to start thinking about making this form out of a hardwood, so something like oak or maple. And then if you were literally going to start to go into industry for yourself and wanted to do this all the time, you'd probably start looking at making an aluminum form or even mild steel form. But for our intents and purposes, we're only making one, so you might be able to get away with MDF. Now, for me, I'm actually going to go with a big chunk of maple hardwood to make mine because I am planning on doing a couple of these, including a version made out of stainless, which brings us to the second part. So the material that you're planning on bending around this form have a huge factor as well. So the video I'm going to be showing you how to make this out of 18 or 19 gauge steel, but I'm planning on trying to make a stainless one after this, and the stainless is way harder to hammer form. It's going to require more force, more effort, longer amount of time hammering, so I don't think the MDF one is going to hold up to that. So rather than making two of these things, I figured I would just make a good one out of hardwood. It's basically the same process for you guys at home. The only thing different is instead of having a big solid chunk of hardwood, you guys are going to have to laminate some 3/4 inch MDF together, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll put a link up to the video above where I had to laminate some pieces together for the monitor mount, and it's the same process. So you just stack this up to the height you want, and then you can make your cuts and make your form. And don't forget, we have to make some kind of clamping piece on the top as well to secure that sheet metal and prevent it from going anywhere else except where we are hammering it. Now, the piece on the top is not going to be the same size. In fact, I would say it probably has to be at least 1/2 inch in from those edges, or another way of designing it is that it should go up to the start of the radius, if there's a radius on it. That way you are securing and holding that sheet metal, and it won't go anywhere there until you start hammering where that curve is. So let's go make this. Now that I have the clamp and the forming piece now cut down to its final dimensions, it is now time to put some curves and some shape to the actual form itself. So to do this, I'm going to be using a router, and I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch radius round over bit to get that. Now, because this piece is so skinny, I'm not able to clamp it in any spots where the base of the router is not going to hit the clamp. So what I'm going to do is clamp a little less than halfway on this piece, router this end, and then I'll move the clamps to the other side and do the other side. And if there's any little kind of like it doesn't seem to blend in nicely, remember we're going to be doing a bunch of hand sanding and filing to get this thing perfect anyway. Now, one other thing that I explain now before I show it is when you're using a router, you look at the direction of the router bit, and you should be kind of going into, the cutter goes into the wood as you're moving. And when you're going with the grain, when you get to the end of the piece, that's not too big of a deal. But when you're going cross grain, when you get to the end of the piece, there's nothing supporting the fibers, and sometimes you can have some pretty nasty tear out. So when I get to the end here, I'm going to have another block that I'm going to clamp in here so that it's flush here and flush there, and that way I can just extend it past and then remove this, and I won't get any tear out on the corner. All right, so these edges are all now rounded over, and the next thing we're going to figure out is how to get the little dip at the very front for where the front of the lockdown bar kind of meets the glass a little bit. So I don't have a actual lockdown bar that I can measure and figure out the dimensions, so I just went looking online and I could not find any drawings of all these accurate dimensions either. So what I did is I just looked at a top-down view of a couple of these and kind of figured roughly what percentage of this width is the dip in the front here. And to me, it looked like about 25%. So when I measure this, that works out to 3/4 of an inch. So I made a 3/4 of an inch line all the way down. And then on the ends here, it remains flat where it goes over top of the stainless steel side playfield trim. which is 3/4 of an inch wide, plus, remember, we want to get over the carriage bolt and the width of that stainless steel trim on the end. So what I've measured from the end is 7/8 of an inch in and made a line there. So this needs to be flat, and then this somewhere here is going to be kind of like an angle as it goes down into the taper that we make here. And then on the very front, I needed to figure out how deep it goes down. So what I did is I measured the plastic glass holder when it's sitting inside of the stainless steel side trim, and I measured it, and it looked like it went down 1/8 of an inch. So I have made a 1/8 inch line all the way on the front. All right, now that we have these two lines to help guide us where we want that dip down at the front of the lockdown bar, the question is, how do we get this off? Now, we could use some rasps and some files and just take our time and use those two lines as a guide, get it close, and then hand sand it to finish. It's not a bad way of doing it. The other way we could do this is use the table saw. Now, we can't just set the angle of the blade to line up with these lines and then cut the entire piece. Otherwise, our ends, where it's supposed to be flat, are going to be taken out. But if we were to set up a test piece and get that scrap angle set perfectly, we might be able to drop this down on the fence, down onto the blade, and then continue the cut, but stop short so that we don't get to the end. Shut the table saw off, hold it there while it stops, and then we just have to finish the ends with some rasps and files, and then do good sanding. So I think that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to show you right now. Okay, so I've got a scrap piece of 2x4 here, and I have laid out the exact dimensions, just like the details on my lockdown bar. So 3/4 of an inch high, 1/8 of an inch in, and I'm going to use this piece to set the angle of the table saw blade so that this side of the blade just touches those 2 points and gets that angle how I want it. And then, because it's a scrap piece, I can do a little dry run and see if this is going to work for me. So I used a protractor and it looked like it was 10 degrees, so I set the blade to 10 degrees, and that looks pretty good to me. So now on for our kind of little test dry run of this scrap piece. For this test cut, I can't have my guards and my anti-kickback fingers and all that attached because this is going to get in the way. So that has been removed. So you're going to have to be careful and make sure that you are not getting your fingers anywhere near this blade. So a little trick is you make sure your fingers are above and even holding on the back side of your fence. That way there's no way it's going to come off and go into the blade. Now, because our test piece doesn't matter, but the lockdown bar, we don't want that angled cut to go all the way to the ends. We have to kind of figure out and lay out a point on the top here where we are going to start kind of dropping in. Now, I am going to have to do some filing and sanding at the ends anyway, but I don't want to have it cut too far. So what I'm thinking is where the blade starts to disappear into the bottom of the surface of the table is going to be where we can lay out one of those stopping points. And like I said, make sure that it is not going to cut past where you don't want it to. So if you want a little bit of clearance and make sure of that, then go a little bit more. So make a mark up here at that mark for where you want it to be flat for this side, and then when this feeds through to the other side, the other edge of the blade where it dips down in underneath the table is going to be another spot. And so once you've marked the depth from the other one, same thing, leave yourself some clearance, transfer that mark. So now these two marks that are on our fence is where we are going to start and drop this in. Then we're going to hold it tightly against the table and the fence and go till this other line meets up with that line. And then I would not try to pick it out. I would kind of just hold it there and kick the off button on the table saw and hold it till it stops. That way there's no chance of any kickback. Okay, let's give this a try and see what it looks like. Cool, so there's our angled piece, and you can see that I've left a little bit of room so that I can file this and by hand and get it to what I want, but there is that angled cut all the way to the other side, so it's nice and uniform. And then same thing, there's some space here to where the cut would be where we want it straight. And then remember, this is just where we set the angle. So that did work. It was a little sketchy. The drop down of the cut down into here kind of bent the blade away from the wood at first, and then as soon as I started cutting, it started to cut a little bit deeper and then get to full thickness here all the way back there, but it did not like the drop in, so I had to basically go the other way to get it to clean up at the other end. So a little sketchy, potential for kickback, and no guards, so you got to be super careful. If this was a little squeamish for you guys and you don't feel comfortable doing that, really it's not a lot of material to just take a rasp and a file to do this as well, considering I got to do the corners right to the end where I want it anyway. Because my scrap test piece was a different thickness, I'm going to creep up on this angle until I just get the top edge of the cut to go with the pencil line here. Almost, just a touch more. Sweet. There you go, we still got some room to get to the end so we can file and finish that up by hand, and then nice even angle all the way to the other end where we have the same deal where we got to clean up with the file. So once I get that shaped in with a file, then I'm going to hand sand that and blend it all in and make it look great. So let's go do that now. Back to looking at some reference pictures from a real pinball cabinet lockdown bar. I roughly figured out that from the end here where I want it straight in 3/8 of an inch, I made a mark. And then from this point to there, I made a line. This is where this form is going to be flat. And then I made a straight line down there, like parallel with this. And so this and the center part can be filed to the angle all the way to that point. And then from here, this area here is going to have an angle to match up with this flat section here. So I did that on both ends. Let's start filing this out. Now this part might be a little tricky, so just take your time so you don't end up with deep grooves and gouges. And remember, we're going to sand this after, so just leave yourself a little witness. Don't go filing all the way down to what you want finished. That way you got room to sand it out as well. So now I got to do this angle, and this will be a bit tricky because I don't want to gouge this and I don't want to touch this. Just this corner and get it to angle. So just take your time and kind of sneak up on it. You can use your fingernail as a guide. And you'll have some time to adjust that plane. So get the angle of that to match the angle there. And make sure you don't go past the 1/8 depth mark, and then you'll be good. And when you get that angle kind of meeting this angle, just kind of take your time and blend it in. That way there's no obvious big kind of gouge. And I'm using a pretty rough file here. You could start switching up to a fine file. And I'm not using even woodworking tools. I'm just using a coarse and a fine metalworking file. All right, I would say that is good enough. So do the same thing on the other side, and then we're going to sand this so it looks beautiful. Okay, that's all rough filed in, so it just needs some sanding. Now, to address the front corner, now this is still too sharp right here, even with this 1/4 inch round over. And when I look at the pictures, it's quite a healthy radius that's in here to kind of make it really nice and soft and the force spread out over the palm. So what I did is I went and looked for my compass kit, and I was planning on trying to figure out what radius that I would make that. And then I kind of just grabbed this little protractor that was here and kind of just laid it out to see what it would look like. And with this against that edge and this against that edge, that is pretty much, I think, the curve that I want, at least where that kind of stops and goes flat again. So I think I'm going to just use this. I will measure it and kind of put in the video what the size or the radius is actually. And then probably the same kind of radius back down here. And then I'm just going to use the same rough files and kind of knock that corner down. And you'll see when I actually do it, the kind of technique, it's not a flat filing motion anymore. It has to be kind of more a rolling, kind of sweeping, so that you can blend these surfaces in with each other. And same thing, we're just going to take our time and just make sure that we can blend it in and not have any flat spots. This curve here is a 2-inch radius. So those of you that don't have this and you got one of these, you can set your compass to 2-inch radius. Make sure the pencil goes to that edge. Adjust it so the pencil goes to that edge. Make sure that's even, and then plant the tip and draw your 2-inch circle along it like that. It's all laid out, so now I have to make sure that when I file, I am not just filing flat down on this. I have to roll the file so that I'm attempting to make a curved corner that blends this surface perfectly with this surface and this surface at the same time. So multiple angles, and just keep rolling the file and take my time, take light cuts, and get it down to where it's nice and round, and it just super blends in with all three surfaces. All right, I would say that that's about right. It feels really nice in the hands now, and the trick is just to get the other side looking exactly the same. Now notice I can still see my pencil marks. If you're taking your pencil marks off, then you lose your guide, right? So you just want to creep up to it. And I still am going to hand sand this a little bit so get all the file marks out as well. But I think that looks pretty good. Man, this thing's really starting to look like a lockdown bar. Cool, this is looking really, really nice after it's been sanded, and I can see why a lot of people just decide to do a wooden lockdown bar. There's no problem with this. It looks actually really quite good. Now, if I wanted to make this a wood lock bar, I wouldn't have made it so thick, and I'd have to do something underneath to be able to mesh with the cabinet so it kind of can sit down and lock in place. But this is definitely all the steps you would need to make one of these wooden lockdown bars as well. But this is just our form. So now moving on to the clamp, we just need to put it on top and see if there's any kind of trimming. I think I might have to add something around the corner where the big curve is. And then we're getting ready for metal. With our clamp kind of centered and in place where it's going to be, you can see it's kind of just ending at the start of the radius, which is exactly where I want it. That way the sheet metal doesn't want to try to go back or buckle weird. It's just going to go over that curve. And I've kind of got it laid out at the front the same. That looks good. And then you can see at the corner, we know this radius goes in a bit. So off camera, I think I'm just going to round this a little bit just so that I can get access to right at the back, and it'll be the same all the way on this side, so that looks okay. And then on the back side where that kind of dip is in the lockdown bar at the front, it's kind of covering it up a little bit. So I might take an 1/8 of an inch, maybe even 1/4 of an inch off of the width here, just to make sure that it looks more like that where the start of that angle is. Cool, the clamp and the form are ready to go. Now, traditionally when you're doing hammer forming, you're gonna put a couple bolt holes through this, probably about 3 or 4 for something this size, and something around like 1/4 inch by 20 kind of bolts. And some washers on both sides that we can bolt and sandwich this together through your piece. Now, we don't want those holes in this lockdown bar. About the only thing you maybe could get away with is if you're putting a center fire button in your lockdown bar, then you could put a bolt and go through that hole. But on mine, I don't want to put that fire button, so I don't want any holes. So what I'm going to try to attempt, and you're going to find out pretty quick whether this works or not, is I'm going to just clamp the crap out of this with as many C-clamps as I can, maybe even a vise. And instead of just hammering away on one side, and maybe the sheet metal gets pulled out when I do that, I'm going to do a little bit on this side, a little bit on this side, a little bit on all four sides, and hopefully that will kind of lock it in place. That way it doesn't move around. So now we got to cut our metal. All right, there you go. This is the steps to either make yourself a wooden lockdown bar or make yourself a form and a clamp so that you can hammer form a sheet metal lockdown bar. Now, with the editing process, this video has become way too long, so I've decided to make this a part 1, and then the very next episode out will be the second half of this video where we actually hammer form, do the epoxy, make the J-hooks, install the toggle clamps, and get this thing all painted and ready to go. So don't miss that. If you have any questions about what we did for the hammer form today, put them down below in the comment section and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And if you haven't already, why don't you join us on Instagram? That way you can get all the behind the scenes pictures and videos that are happening between the videos. Until next time, take it easy.